Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on professional ethics and ACPE as part of the core curriculum for the certification process phase 2. I'm Julie Hanada. I'm starting this webinar and will be joined by Christina Stevenson and Carl Van Harn. We are current members of the ACPE Professional Ethics Commission. Although this presentation is informational in nature, there are differences between informational content and the impact it may have on any attending this webinar. We want to be mindful of the impact because memories and emotions that it might evoke, perhaps because of something that has happened to you or something that you did or failed to do in the moment. Be gentle with yourself. This is hard work, and it is worthwhile. It will support you to be an educator with integrity and to support your students to become the professional care providers with integrity. Throughout this presentation, you're encouraged to record what comes up for you. You may want to keep some paper or an electronic device available to take notes on. This presentation is set up to review a variety of topics that you see listed here. The bulk of our time will be on professional code of ethics and the ACPE complaint process. Let's start with a quick overview of the phase 1 and phase 2 assessment competencies. In the left column, you see phase 1 assessment competencies in the area of ethics. Now let's view the phase 2 assessment competencies in the area of ethics. Note the difference in the language, how these competencies focus on one's identity as educators compared to phase 1 competencies. As you go through this webinar, please consider how the phase 1 competencies contribute to your development as an educator. We will now look at each of these 4 phase 1 competencies and their implications for professional ethics. P2.1, adherence to the ACP standards and manuals and the ACP Code of Professional Ethics as an educator. The Professional Ethics Code addresses ethics in reference to the 5 dimensions: those served, other groups, ACP as an organization, colleagues, and business matters. For each of these 5 points, we encourage you to consider the following questions. What is the significance in adding as an educator to the competencies in phase 2? How is this ethics code congruent with your spiritual belief system and educational theories? How have you expanded your own learning process to address the code? Let's take a look at each of these in more detail. The first ethics code standard we look at is in relationship to those served. Please be aware that we have summarized each of the points in each of the code standards to the sake of making it presentable on the slide. How is your role as an educator unique to the code, to the ethics code, than this, for example, to a student? How is this ethics code congruent or incongruent with your spiritual beliefs system and educational theories? And how have you expanded your own learning process to address this code? This is the second standard in the code that relates to our relationship with groups as a chaplain, organization, spiritual communities, employment relationships, educational relationships. In addition to the questions posed in the previous slide, how do you maintain and foster these relationships to meet the code? This is the third standard in the code, behavior as it relates to ACPE. Please take a moment to reflect on these points. How do you maintain your own professional code? How do you maintain your own professional growth as a care provider, and how do you maintain it as an educator? How do you ensure appropriate use of power and accurate presentation of your credentials? And this is the fourth standard of the code. This standard covers relationships with colleagues, both educators as colleagues and as chaplain colleagues, colleagues in organization, colleagues on the interdisciplinary team, and so on. What would make it difficult to live into the standard? And what might you need to do to ensure your own adherence to the standard? This is the fifth standard in the code, relationships to business matters. In addition, the questions posed to you previously, what accreditation policies are related to this code? What are your own and your program's practices to ensure the code and policies are followed? As part of this competency, becoming familiar with the compliant process is a necessary component. Since 2005, ACPE and APC have shared a joint process for processing complaints against their members. We will spend just a few slides on the complaint process. We would encourage you to review the professional ethics module from the phase 1 set of webinars, which covers it in detail. Covers the complaint process. You're encouraged also to take some time to review the professional ethics manual, as well as your own center's policies and process for complaints. To start, most of us are familiar with the legal system, languages, and process than our own complaint process. While there may be some similarities, they are not the same, and it is important to know there are differences. The consequences for not complying with our ethics rule process can be a range of sanctions starting with a reprimand and all the way to a suspension or revocation of credentials, as opposed to the legal process that could result in being found liable to another for damages or being fired or imprisoned. Our process is less stringent than the legal process dealing with a grievance. So we talk about fair process rather than due process. For example, we don't have judicial authority. That is, we cannot issue subpoenas, compel witnesses, hold people in contempt, or allow to cross-examination of witnesses and the parties of the complainant. Our process also is not the same as a legal malpractice complaint because we can't award damages to the aggrieved person. We can use the term most reasonable conclusion and credible and reasonable in determining resolution of complaints through ACPE and APC rather than beyond reasonable doubt. Let's briefly review the complaint process. After the complaint arrives in the national office, the initial review panel in a review called IRP1 will determine jurisdiction. If the criteria are met, if jurisdiction is established, then a response is requested of the person against whom the complaint is filed. Next, the initial review panel will review the respondent's response called IRP2 and assess the response and select an action. An action may be to dismiss the complaint, to return it to the local level, mediation. It may move forward with an investigation or actions. If the process continues, then generally an investigation starts as more information is sought from both parties and others who may be knowledgeable about the situation. Once an investigation is concluded and a summary report is assembled and sent to the select ethics commission members who form a hearing panel. The hearing panel is comprised of both ACPE and APC members. At the hearing panel, both complaint and respondent are interviewed. After that, the committee determines and makes a decision. It may conclude that no violation of the code occurred, or if it did, then the panel determines what sanctions to impose. Either party may appeal the process, but only if the grounds of improper process and not because they do not like the decision. As a certified educator, you will need to be familiar with the processes, the policies that relate to various types of complaints in addition to ethics complaints. When you download this PowerPoint, these links will take you to the location of these documents and the ACPE website. The ACP Code of Professional Ethics standards are aligned with ACPE accreditation standards. Of the 7 accreditation standards, Standard 7 deals with ethical integrity in a center. Standard 7 covers ethical integrity and cultural responsiveness. It outlines how the ethics codes are to be implemented in one's programs and how specific values are to undergird their implementation. Please review your own program's policies and practices to see the integration of the ACP Code of Professional Ethics. As you review them, would you make any suggestions to your program manager, department director, or professional advisory group? I'm going to now pass this webinar on to my colleague, Christina.
Moving to competencies, competency P.2 states that a competent educator deports oneself in a manner that reflects ethical conduct appropriate to the role and context as an educator. The ACP Professional Ethics Code is all about relationships and our care in those relationships, interactions with, and responsibility to others. These 3 areas, diversity and inclusion, professionalism, and communication, offer challenging ways in which an educator might engage in his, her, or their professional relationships. They're often areas of concern in ethics complaints. In phase 1, you were asked to demonstrate knowledge and application of ethical decision-making process applicable to context. This competency in phase 2 goes beyond knowledge and asks for advocacy for an embodiment and integration of such knowledge in one's own demeanor and identity. So this competency in the area of diversity and inclusion is one of the Ethics Commission receives the most complaints about. We will take some time to look at the issues related to diversity and inclusion. will review areas of overt and covert discrimination, bias and prejudice, microaggressions, and contextuality. So issues related to diversity and inclusion, overt and covert discrimination. Overt discrimination is regulated by laws such as Title VII and the Civil Rights Acts, ADA, ADEA, that are enforced by the Employment Commission. Covert discrimination can be even more likely to occur when and where there are such successfully installed equal opportunity policies for employment and admission to CPE. So other than your center's policy, how else are you aware of, and how do you ensure sensitivity to discrimination as practiced in your center, in your practices? So issues related to diversity and inclusion, including bias and prejudice. Most bias is implicit and pre-reflective. That means it's more than just racial naivete or benign ignorance. One ways that you might want to explore your own biases is to implicit association test. In the resource, we'll give a link to that. It is very revealing and informative. If you've gotten this far in the certification process, you're more likely have some awareness of your biases and prejudice. And you've taken steps to self-supervise around them. So if you have not done that already, please take this implicit association test. So other issues related to diversity and inclusion include microaggressions, microinvalidations. Microaggressions are thinly veiled, subtle, intentional, or unintentional everyday instances of racism, homophobia, sexism, ableism, and other forms of discrimination against groups that are oppressed. Microinvalidations is a form of microaggression. It's insensitive communications that demean someone's racial or gender identity or other categories of oppression or marginalization, signaling that their contribution are trivial or unimportant, and negating or ignoring the thoughts, beliefs, feelings, or experiential reality of Black, Indigenous, people of color, marginalized persons. How do you stay current with learning about these topics and the growing awareness around issues of racism and other types of prejudice? We had the opportunity to learn about that during our annual conference this past May. Microaggressions are often comments or gestures that communicate some sorts of bias toward the person. Specifically, they're used to indicate insulting or demeaning comments toward historically marginalized groups. Daryl Wing Sue, a Columbia University professor of psychology and education, has done a lot of work on microaggressions and defines them as prejudices that leak out in many interpersonal situations and decision points. Many recent complaints deal with microaggressions resulting from a lack of awareness about the dominant group's members' participation in racism, other forms of oppression. So again, issues related to diversity and inclusion, as in contextuality. Contextuality is the importance of learning the context in which one is practicing, as well as acting in congruence with the professional setting of employment. Whether it's faith-based, government-based, we have to know the standards of the context in which we practice. Are there any issues in your work environment that you have to be aware of and sensitive about that might impact your students' experience? So moving on to issues related to professionalism, honesty, respect, emotional expression, humor and play, negligence, neglect. As professional educators, we model professional behavior and demonstrate integration of our values into our actions. Here are some issues that frame professionalism. Some of these issues are the base of claims of ethics violations in complaints. Whether that is rolling our eyes when somebody's speaking or creating an environment where some people might feel excluded or pushing boundaries beyond appropriate educational interventions is often an accumulation of these issues. Some more issues related to professionalism: boundaries, use of power, self-care, and we're going to look at them a little bit more in depth. So boundaries might include use of self-disclosure, way in which we socialize, working within one's competence, intrusiveness, dual roles, conflict of interest, favor exchanges. Use of power might be harassment, intimidation, exploitation, coercion, preferential treatment, even bullying, manipulation, scapegoating, proselytizing, or imposing one's perspective. And self-care, self-neglect, substandard appearance, inappropriate dress, or personal hygiene. Let's look at boundaries as ethical pitfalls for a moment. Boundaries between an educator and student provide a framework that guides and manages expectations, roles, self-disclosures. One of the greatest challenges facing educators is allowing soft enough boundaries to convey similarity, emotional availability, modeling empathy, while simultaneously holding firm enough boundaries to differentiate from students on a professional dimension. Other areas to be sensitive with boundaries issues include extent and manner of socializing, working within one's competence and expertise, intrusiveness, dual roles, conflictive favors, and etc. Given the intimacy developed in the context of the supervisory and or group relationships, one must be attentive to healthy and respectful sexual boundaries. What theories have you identified that support you to establish and maintain a framework within boundaries? So what are the good ingredients of good boundaries? Let's look at some of these. Regular consultation with peers, avoiding working in isolation, avoiding making exceptions, awareness of one's vulnerabilities, addressing one's needs for intimacy, deep understanding of power dynamics, knowledge in trauma-informed theory. Which of these are you actively using? Which of these could be used in the future for you? Now let's look at the issue of ethically negotiating power. We will look at use of power, power differential, and power dynamics. Use of power in an ethical violation might be harassment, might be intimidation, might be exploitation, coercion, as we mentioned, preferential treatment, manipulation, scapegoating, proselytizing, etc. The power differential in the educator-student relationship is a key ethical issue. There is no symmetry of power in the educator-student relationship. The educator always bears greater responsibility in conducting oneself ethically. At the same time, power is not static and unilateral, but it's mutually constructed, developed, always negotiated. An effective and ethical power dynamic in the educator-student relationship depends on the creation of an interactional space based on trust and respect. The power dynamics related to educator and students' affiliation with dominant versus non-dominant groups significantly impact the power dynamic and always must be considered. What theories have you identified that support you to establish and maintain a good use of power? And what are the ingredients to maintain a healthy use of power? Here's some of them. Again, regular consultation, cultural humility, deep understanding of power dynamics, awareness of one's vulnerability, addressing one's needs for intimacy, avoiding making exception, avoiding working in isolation, support resources, prayer, meditation, spiritual practices, stress relief tools. Which do you use currently, and which of these could be used in the future for you? Now let's look at self-care as an ethical issue. Self-care is not only good for you, it is an ethical issue. Some signs that a person is not attending to self-care is self-neglect, changes in a person's behavior or habits that might be noticeable, such as emotional volatility, increased strictness, or apathy. Others are more subtle. What are your clues that warn you that you may be needing to address self-care issues? Professional self-care is critical in preventing burnout and maintaining a balanced work-life perspective. Failing to tend to one's need is one of the primary reasons educators lose their grip on sound ethical judgment and attunement. Again, these are some ingredients for good self-care. They're all similar, obviously overlapping: regular consultation, support resources, prayer, meditation, spiritual practices, sleep, rest, regular exercise, health maintenance, stress relief tool, diversion, healthy eating, vacation time, time off, friendships, pets, and then you may have others. Our third area of ethical concern as relates to this particular standard is around issues of communication. And here's some examples: social media, confidentiality, respect, use of personal knowledge, intellectual property, credentials, and so on. I am going to pass this on to my colleague, Carl Barnhart, for an overview of issues related to communication.
Let's take a closer look at these issues. Social media, confidentiality, and respect. Social media refers to the comments on public-private sites, level of privacy, friending, unfriending, trolling. Confidentiality refers to students' material, individual versus group supervision, carelessness in handling printed materials, recording students on video conferencing without permission. And respect involves tone of voice, eye contact, interruptions, body language, use of profanity, abusive language, sarcastic or under-breath comments, comments on appearance, backhanded compliments. We now live in a very public world where our conduct is visible by a much wider range of society and scrutinized more closely. We also live in a world, particularly in healthcare, where issues of privacy and confidentiality have become extremely hot items. As you look at each of these areas, what adjustments or changes are you making as you develop into an educator. Other issues are use of personal knowledge, intellectual property, and credentials. Use of personal knowledge involves using knowledge from a student's CPE process, for example, in hiring for a chaplain position. Intellectual property may involve plagiarism, including self-plagiarism, falsification, or materials belonging to employers. And credentials involves being precise about qualifications, degrees, and professional experience. Again, with so much information being available online, these issues are very important to be mindful about. Let's move to competency P2.3. Engages in broader context to understand and safeguard the welfare of others. Let's start by taking a closer look at what engaging in broader context means. It means bringing a critical analysis of injustice into the curriculum to equip students to understand and intervene in systems of oppression. It means modeling engagement in advocacy and resistance to unjust systems. Let's unpack what it means to understand and safeguard the welfare of others. Understand. Privileged groups need to do their own homework. What this means for you will depend in part upon your social location. If you are a part of a privileged group, it is important to do your own homework. It is easy for those with privilege to rely on those with less privilege to educate us, which places more burden on others for our learning. We need to do our own homework to understand the broader social systems and structures that oppress and harm people. Safeguard. Sensitivity and understanding can be developed, but rarely enforced. A sense of social justice and responsibility to society requires us to work to change structures and power relationships that present barriers to better quality of life for all people. Educating oneself and others on an individual basis does not mean that those in vulnerable positions will be free from oppression and injustice. Racism and other forms of oppression are structurally and institutionally established. This competency links conceptual understanding and engaged dynamic action for the well-being of all in our complex world. What are you already doing to educate yourself about social injustices? What actions can you take to contribute to safeguarding the welfare of others? How does your work connect with your spiritual beliefs? In phase 2, one takes a more wide-angle view of this competency. How do we make an impact in the context where we operate? What avenues are open to us? This is especially important for those who come from a position of privilege, to use these avenues for allying with those with less privilege. Here are several types of contexts where we can engage to understand and safeguard the welfare of others. Our workplace, committees or task forces, interdisciplinary settings, regional, state, or national boards, spiritual communities, civic or social groups, communities of practice, educational institutions, and professional associations. What comes up for you as you think how you can demonstrate how you meet this competency? Being involved is possible even when time is tight. Do you read the This Week at ACPE that comes into your email inbox every Monday? Do you participate in elections and surveys? Serving in leadership in ACPE is a wonderful way to engage our broader context. Certain issues have become more relevant to our membership because of the work of educators who are passionate around those issues. For example, ACPE has become more social justice conscious over the years because concerned people were sensitive to these issues, saw their impact on students, brought them forward, and promoted education and change. Let's look at P2.4, holds others accountable to ethical standards. Reach out to the ACPE Professional Ethics Commission, Professional PEC, or the ACPE Executive Director for consultation as to what type of actions might be best suited in a particular situation. Whenever there are issues and growing concerns, a consultation is always advisable. You can reach out in confidentiality to discern the best course of action. If there's a concern about impairment of a colleague or student, or concerns about competence, or concerns about misconduct, seek consultation. This is also true if one is being threatened with a complaint by a student. Consultations are advisable. What concerns might you have about upholding this standard? There are three avenues for accountability in the ways by which they are accessed. Incompetence. This is accessed through the educational complaint process with the Accreditation Commission via the ACPE Executive Director. Accountability for impairment involves notification to the Professional Ethics Commission and the Wellbeing Committee via the Director of Communities of Practice. And concerns around misconduct, for example, violation of the Code of Ethics, is accessed through the Professional Ethics Commission via the ACPE or APC Executive Directors. Let's take a moment to address anonymity. Anonymous ethical complaints cannot be processed by the Professional Ethics Commission. With anonymity, a respondent in an ethics complaint does not have an opportunity to give their side of the event. Part of fair process for ethics violations is the right for notice to all parties, which includes a respondent's right to be notified of the nature of the complaint and who is making it. There is no similar requirement for education complaints. The United States Department of Education requires us as an accrediting institution to allow for anonymous education complaints. Notification of possible impairment can be submitted anonymously as well. Impairment situations involve patterns of behaviors or inability to perform one's work and responsibilities. This is a helpful model to keep in mind when assessing if someone's conduct can be deemed a violation and what actions are appropriate. If a single incident occurs, perhaps an informal collegial conversation would address and resolve the issue. If the occurrences continue and informal conversations are not effective, then the situation is becoming an apparent pattern and moves up to level 1, where bringing the concerns to more awareness is required. In these cases, more formal coaching and involvement by others of the local level, such as your peer group, manager, or human resources representative may be necessary. Going up the triangle, if the incidents continue to occur, then a persistent pattern will most likely require guided interventions, and authorities need to be notified. At the top of the triangle, disciplinary action is implemented. A one-time event may not warrant an ethics complaint if it can be resolved locally with corrective counseling or coaching by the professional advisory group chair, department director, human resources, or others. However, even a one-time event does warrant an ethics complaint if the matter is serious or egregious, such as sexual misconduct, or if it is a mandated responsibility, such as breaking a student's confidentiality with delicate personal material. And finally, here are some resources. To close, as you navigate ethical issues at your center and in your development and evolution as an educator, please use consultation with your educator or peer group to explore and clarify nuances. If there are two areas of attention that keep educators grounded and sound, it is self-care and consultation. Take care and best wishes in your process.